The pencil had worn a shallow groove into the same strip of paper, a soft, familiar rasp that came and went like breathing. Someone pressed too hard, then eased off. The scratch resumed, stopped, resumed again, as if the hand holding it needed the sound to prove the minutes were still moving. A clock ticked somewhere beyond the wall, steady, patient, almost polite. Between ticks there was the faintest hum of air through a seam, a draft finding the one place it could still get in. It lifted the corner of a sheet, let it fall, lifted it again. The paper made a dry, tired whisper each time, like cloth rubbed between fingers. A boot heel tapped once against the floor and did not repeat. The silence after it felt intentional, like a decision made without words. Somewhere nearby, a cup was set down carefully, porcelain against wood, as if loud sounds could be punished. The cup's small ring died quickly, swallowed by the room. There were other noises that kept trying to become normal. The slow click of a metal clasp being opened and closed, a match drawn along a rough surface, flaring, then the quiet crackle of a flame held too long in one place. The thin, irregular pull of someone lighting a cigarette and trying not to cough. Smoke moved in layers you couldn't see but could feel, warmth and bitterness sliding across the back of the throat, then thinning out. A man at the table, only a presence, not a face, folded a strip of paper and unfolded it again, folded it a second time, smoothed it with the flat of his palm, as if the act could flatten whatever was written there. His fingers hesitated at the edge, then tapped it twice, not in impatience but in counting. A slow count, like prayer. Someone else kept touching a pocket watch without looking at it. The chain shifted. The lid clicked open and shut. Open, shut, open, shut. The ritual was steady enough to feel like reassurance, but the sound was too sharp in the quiet, like a needle on glass. From outside, far enough to be uncertain, came a low murmur of movement. Not voices, not yet. Just the soft, continuous shuffle of many things being carried, placed, lifted again. The kind of labor that never announces itself, only proves it exists by refusing to stop. Once, a distant door banged and the room stiffened, every body listening for what might follow. Nothing did. The clock kept ticking as if it hadn't noticed. A chair creaked, weight shifting carefully. Someone cleared his throat, then seemed to regret it. The air held the small sound too long, stretching it until it felt like interruption. No one spoke. Words would have made the waiting real. A hand, different hands, same motion, kept returning to the same stack of documents. The top sheet was lifted, held up to the light, lowered again, lifted again. There was no new information on it, but the act of checking was a way to keep the mind busy, to keep it from drifting toward the edges of thought where fear lived. On the table, an ink bottle sat uncapped, and the smell of it rose in a dark, bitter bloom. A pen tip hovered above a line, the point trembling slightly, then pulling away. The hesitation was almost tender, as if the paper might bruise. A thin wire in the corner of the room vibrated once, barely a sound, more a feeling, then went still. A lamp hissed softly, the flame steady, then fluttering for a second when the draft found it again. Shadows shifted across the wall and returned to their places. Everything corrected itself. Everything pretended. Someone began to hum under his breath, not a tune you could follow, just a thread of sound meant to fill the gaps. It stopped when he realized he was doing it. The silence returned heavier, as if it had been waiting just outside the door. Another tick. Another. The clock insisted on order. A finger traced the edge of a map, following a line, then stopping at a point and staying there, pressed down as if to pin the world in place. The fingertip didn't move for a long time. When it finally lifted, it left a faint smudge behind, a tiny blur where certainty used to be. There was a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that the room was listening. Not for news, not for instructions, for a particular sound that had not yet come, for the scrape of footsteps on the other side of the door, for the metallic clack of a latch, for a voice calling a name. The pencil scratched again, harder now, and the paper complained. Then it stopped completely, and in the pause that followed, too long to be comfortable, the clock kept ticking, and it began to feel like it was counting down. The place revealed itself the way a body reveals an old injury. Not all at once, but in small, involuntary signs. The air smelled of damp wool and burnt coffee, of metal warmed by hands and then left to cool. The room was long and low-ceilinged. built for practicality rather than comfort, with plaster that had been repainted too many times and had begun to blister in shallow bubbles. A single stove sat against one wall, its iron sides dark with soot, the pipe climbing upward as if trying to escape. It worked, but only in the way tired things work. Enough to keep men from freezing, not enough to make them forget the season. On a table near the stove, an enamel pot held what passed for coffee. Someone had watered it down again. You could tell by the way the smell promised warmth but delivered only bitterness. A younger man, his uniform jacket hanging slightly loose on his shoulders, kept returning to the pot as if it were an assignment. He poured, he wiped the rim, he poured again. Each time he carried a cup across the room with exaggerated care, not because the cup was precious, but because the act of care itself felt like order. The map table was the true center of the room. It occupied the best light, beneath a hanging lamp with a metal shade. The lamp had a habit of flickering when the generator outside coughed, and every time it did, the men around the table paused, eyes lifting briefly, as if darkness might bring a different kind of instruction. The map beneath their hands was pinned at the corners with heavy objects, an ashtray, a field manual, a paperweight shaped like a small block of brass. Lines had been drawn and redrawn until the paper looked bruised. A radio sat on a separate desk, its casing scratched, its knobs worn smooth. A set of headphones rested beside it like sleeping animals. The operator was there too, seated upright in a way that suggested he had learned not to relax even when nothing was happening. He listened with one ear, then wrote something, then stopped and listened again. He did not speak unless spoken to. Silence was his rank. Beyond the single window, its glass clouded, its frame painted shut long ago, daylight existed in a dull, colorless way. It was the kind of light that made everything look older. Outside, somewhere unseen, came the rhythmic clank of men loading crates, the soft grind of wheels in mud, the occasional snap of a shouted word that didn't carry fully through the walls. It was a working day. It had all the texture of normal. That was the trick. Everything, on the surface, behaved like a routine. A lieutenant, clean-shaven with a scarf tucked into his collar, stood near the stove reading a short list on a clipboard. He read it once, then again, as if the second time might change the names. When he finished, he folded the paper and placed it in his pocket with a care that bordered on respect. Then he turned his attention to the men near the map and asked, in a voice that tried to sound casual, whether anyone wanted sugar. It was an absurd question in a place that measured life in rations, but it was asked anyway. Someone laughed once, quickly, politely, and the laugh died as soon as it was born. Another man, older, kept smoothing his mustache with 2 fingers. He did it when he thought no one was watching. He did it when the lamp flickered. He did it when the radio operator paused mid-sentence in his writing. It was not vanity. It was a metronome for the nerves. On a shelf against the wall sat stacked folders tied with string, their edges frayed. Above them, a row of hooks held coats, helmets, and a single pair of gloves that had been repaired so often the stitching looked like a second skin. The gloves belonged to no one in particular anymore. They were simply there, available, waiting to be used again. At the far end of the room was the door, and beside it a runner sat on a bench, boots unlaced, hands resting on his knees. He was young in the way war made young men look young, too thin, too alert, with eyes that jumped at small sounds. Every few minutes he stood, stretched his legs, sat again. He did not leave. He was waiting to be sent, and in that waiting he was like every other object in the room, held in readiness, kept in place by an expectation that had not yet found its moment. Outside, the base functioned with the practiced efficiency of habit. A vehicle engine turned over and settled into a low, steady idle. Men called to each other in clipped phrases. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Somewhere, a hammer struck metal. 3 hits in the same rhythm, as if someone believed repetition could keep things stable. The officers at the map table spoke in a tone that deliberately avoided urgency. They discussed ordinary problems, fuel allocation, the timing of a supply convoy, a set of coordinates that needed to be verified. Their words were technical, carefully measured, as if they were building a wall out of procedure. They didn't look at each other for long. They looked at paper. Paper was safer. One of them, the senior, his sleeves rolled up, his collar undone, kept checking a small notebook where he had written times in a neat hand. He ran his finger along the entries, then tapped the last one as if to remind himself that it was real. He glanced at the clock, not dramatically, just enough to suggest he was aware of it. The clock ticked with the same calm authority it had in the cold open, and now, with faces visible and uniforms named by their insignia, the ticking felt worse, because it had a job. The generator coughed again. The lamp flickered. Shadows jerked across the map like living things. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then the lamp steadied, and everyone continued as if nothing had happened. The coffee was poured again. The radio operator adjusted a knob with 2 fingers. The mustached man smoothed his upper lip. The runner stood and sat. Normality, maintained by sheer will. But small irregularities kept appearing, like cracks in ice. A message came in, quietly, without drama. The radio operator wrote it down, tore off the paper, and carried it to the map table. His steps were careful, almost ceremonial. He handed the note over, then returned to his chair without waiting for reaction. The senior officer read it. His eyes moved across the words once, then again. He did not change expression. He folded the paper and placed it beside the brass weight. "Probably nothing," he said. Not to anyone in particular. No one challenged him. The phrase was accepted the way men accept weather. Someone nodded. Someone asked about the convoy again. The discussion resumed, but the words came a fraction slower, as if everyone had begun counting syllables to avoid silence. Another message followed 20 minutes later, then another. Each time the ritual repeated. Write, tear, carry, hand over, fold, weigh down. Each time the senior officer's mouth formed the same kind of calm. Each time the room believed him, because belief was easier than the alternative. And still, the world outside continued its routines with stubborn devotion. Men walked past the window carrying crates. A distant laugh, real, surprisingly warm, rose and fell. Someone whistled briefly while working. It was the sound of people insisting on an ordinary day because they had no other day available. The youngest officer at the table, barely old enough to grow a full beard, leaned in closer to the map. He pointed at a line and asked a question that sounded like a simple clarification. His voice was steady, but his fingertip trembled faintly against the paper. The older men answered impatiently. They did not mention the tremor. They did not mention the clock. At one point, someone opened the door to let in a messenger. Cold air swept through, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and diesel. The lamp flame dipped. Papers lifted and settled. The messenger delivered a short phrase in a low voice, then left. The door shut again, sealing them back into the room with the stove, the map, and the ticking. After the messenger left, nobody moved for a few seconds. Then the senior officer cleared his throat and asked casually if anyone had seen the spare batteries. The question was mundane enough to be comforting. Men stood, checked drawers, lifted boxes. For a while, the search filled the room with purposeful movement. They found the batteries exactly where they had always been. Someone made a small joke about it. It earned a quiet chuckle, and under that chuckle, the clock continued, unamused. By late afternoon, the light outside had not changed much. It only thinned, as if someone were slowly turning down a lantern. The window glass turned the day into something pale and distant. The room felt increasingly separate from the world, like a compartment in a ship. Another message came. This one stayed in the senior officer's hand longer. He read it, then looked toward the window. Not out of hope, not out of curiosity, out of habit, as if the outside could confirm what paper suggested. His face stayed composed, but his fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the note. He folded it anyway. He placed it beside the others. He pressed the brass weight down a little harder than necessary. "Still nothing," he said, and the lie was gentle enough that it almost sounded like mercy. Nobody argued, but the runner by the door had stopped sitting. He stood now, boots laced at last, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the latch as if it might move on its own. He didn't realize he was doing it. His body had simply begun preparing as bodies do when the mind refuses to admit what it already knows. The stove crackled softly. The coffee pot steamed weakly. The map lay flat and innocent under the lamp, and the clock kept ticking calm and exact, as if it had been waiting its entire life for this particular evening. The first sign arrived so quietly it blended into the room's habits. The radio operator paused mid-sentence in his writing, pen hovering above the page. He tilted his head slightly, as if adjusting to an uncomfortable thought rather than a sound. The headphones stayed in place. The radio itself offered nothing dramatic, no burst of static, no raised voice, just a subtle change in texture, a thinning of the background murmur that made the silence between transmissions feel wider than before. He waited, counted, then wrote again. At the map table, the youngest officer asked for a ruler. When none appeared immediately, he reached for the edge of a field manual instead, aligning it carefully along a penciled line. The manual slipped slightly, skewing the line by a few degrees. He corrected it, frowned, corrected it again. No one commented. Precision was important, but not important enough to interrupt the rhythm of calm. Outside, the sound of loading slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. Crates still moved, but with longer gaps between them. The clank of metal against metal lost its earlier regularity. The men inside noticed it only in the way one notices a change in weather through the bones, vaguely, without forming words. Another message came in. This one was shorter. The radio operator read it twice before writing anything. When he tore the paper free, the sound of the rip seemed too loud. He winced almost imperceptibly, then walked it over. The senior officer accepted the note, nodded once, and set it down without folding it right away. That alone should have meant something. Instead, someone near the stove asked whether the water had boiled yet, and the moment passed. The note was folded eventually, placed beneath the brass weight. The stack grew thicker. A man at the far side of the table traced a route with his finger and remarked that the terrain looked easier than expected. He said it lightly, almost cheerfully, as if grateful for a small kindness from the map. No one contradicted him. Someone murmured agreement. The optimism sat strangely in the room, but it was allowed to stay. The clock reached a quarter hour and clicked through it without ceremony. In the corner, the mustached officer smoothed his upper lip again, then stopped halfway through the motion, fingers hovering in the air. He dropped his hand to his side and stood very still, as if testing whether his own body would betray him if he let it. After a moment, he resumed the habit, slower now. A draft moved through the room, not from the door this time, but from the stovepipe. The lamp flame leaned, straightened, leaned again. Shadows stretched along the map, touching places no one's finger had pointed to yet. The men around the table did not look at those areas. They kept their attention where it was expected to be. Another vehicle engine outside turned over, failed, turned over again. The sound carried differently now, more exposed. Someone inside the room glanced toward the window, then quickly looked back down. The glass showed nothing useful, just a pale reflection of their own movement. The radio operator adjusted a knob and frowned. He wrote a single word, crossed it out, wrote another. When he finally tore the page free, he hesitated before standing. The hesitation was small, but it existed. He carried the note over. This time the senior officer did not speak immediately after reading. He pressed his thumb into the crease of the paper, flattening it. His jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. When he did speak, his voice was even. "Signal drift," he said. "Nothing we haven't seen before." The phrase settled over the room like a blanket, warm, heavy, comforting enough to smother questions. The youngest officer nodded a little too quickly. He returned to the map and erased a mark he had made earlier, then redrew it almost exactly where it had been. The act felt necessary, even if it changed nothing. The runner by the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He checked his watch, then tucked it away without looking at the time. The latch remained still. The door did not open. The world outside seemed to be holding itself back. Another irregularity appeared in the most ordinary way possible. Someone counted. Not out loud. Under his breath. It was the man with the notebook, the one who tracked times. His lips moved faintly as he followed the entries with his finger. When he reached the bottom of the page, he stopped counting, stared at the empty space below, and turned the page as if expecting more entries to be there already. There were none. He closed the notebook and slid it into his pocket. He did not mention that the next expected time had already passed. Coffee cups stood untouched now, their contents cooling into something undrinkable. The younger man who had been pouring earlier hovered near the pot, then seemed to realize there was no reason to keep doing it. He stepped away, hands empty, unsure where to put them. From outside came a brief shout, sharper than the others, more urgent, but it cut off abruptly, replaced by something quieter, harder to interpret. The room stilled, every ear reaching outward. Seconds passed. Then the normal noises resumed, thinner than before. The interruption was dismissed without discussion, like a thought no one wanted to finish. Another message arrived, then another. They came closer together now, though no one said so. Each one was handled with the same ritual, the same practiced calm. The stack beneath the brass weight grew uneven. The paper edges no longer lined up neatly. At one point, the senior officer reached to straighten them, then stopped. He withdrew his hand as if the papers might burn. The lamp flickered again. This time it took longer to steady. Someone suggested opening the window slightly to clear the smoke. The idea was considered, then rejected. The cold would be distracting. The lamp needed protecting. The suggestion dissolved into a discussion about airflow that went nowhere and ended without a decision. The radio operator removed one headphone briefly, rubbed his ear, then replaced it. His eyes had gone glassy with focus. When he wrote now, his handwriting slanted a little to the right. A subtle sound emerged beneath everything else. A distant, continuous vibration, too low to be identified immediately. It might have been machinery. It might have been wind. It might have been nothing at all. The men in the room did not comment on it, but several of them shifted unconsciously, adjusting their stance as if the floor itself had changed. The map table felt crowded now, though no one new had arrived. Elbows brushed, hands overlapped. The youngest officer apologized when his sleeve touched another man's wrist, even though the contact had been minimal. The apology was accepted with a nod that lasted too long. The clock passed another quarter hour. This time, the ticking sounded louder, or perhaps the room had simply grown quieter around it. The mustached officer stopped smoothing his lip entirely. His hands hung motionless at his sides, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the map, unfocused. When someone spoke his name, he startled slightly and forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. Outside, the loading stopped altogether. No announcement marked the change. No shouted orders. The absence itself did the work. The silence pressed against the window glass, testing it. Inside, the stove crackled, unaware. The lamp burned. The radio murmured. Routine continued to assert itself, stubborn and inadequate. The senior officer checked his watch at last. Not openly, just a glance, so quick it could have been missed. He did not share what he saw. Instead, he asked whether the men had eaten. The question landed strangely. A few answered. A few shook their heads. Someone said they could eat later. The idea of later hung in the air, undefined. Another message came in. The radio operator did not tear the paper immediately this time. He held it, eyes scanning back and forth, then stood without waiting for instruction. When he reached the table, he handed the note over with both hands. The senior officer read it. He read it again. For a brief moment, so brief it could be denied, his eyes flicked to the door. Then he folded the paper with deliberate care and placed it beneath the weight. Still no confirmation, he said. No one asked what kind of confirmation he meant. The youngest officer leaned closer to the map again, tracing a route that had already been traced dozens of times. His finger paused at a junction, hesitated, then moved on without comment. The choice was made by omission. The runner by the door took one step forward, then stopped himself. He remained there, half committed, as if waiting for permission that might never come. The vibration beneath the floor grew more distinct now, enough to be felt through the soles of boots. Someone noticed. Of course they did. But noticing was not the same as naming, and naming would have required action. Instead, the senior officer began discussing tomorrow's schedule. He spoke of it calmly, methodically, as if tomorrow were guaranteed. The men listened, some nodded, some took notes, some took. And beneath the steady voice, beneath the ticking clock and the low murmur of the radio, the sense of ignored warning settled deeper into the room, quiet, patient, and no longer waiting to be acknowledged. Time began to behave differently, not dramatically, but with a subtle impatience, like a man tapping his foot without realizing it. The clock still ticked, but the spaces between ticks felt shorter, compressed by attention. Every sound seemed to arrive sooner than expected. The lamp flickered more often now, each flutter stealing a fraction of certainty before giving it back. The men noticed, but they noticed everything now, and noticing had become exhausting. The senior officer closed his notebook. The soft thud of the cover landing felt heavier than it should have. He rested both palms on the table, spreading his fingers against the map as if to anchor himself. The paper was cool beneath his skin. Too cool. Someone suggested checking the relay station again. Just a verification, nothing urgent. The suggestion was phrased carefully, wrapped in neutrality. It hung there for a moment, suspended. The senior officer nodded once. "In a minute," he said. The minute did not arrive. Instead, the radio operator shifted in his chair. He adjusted the headphones, then adjusted them again, then finally removed one ear cup and listened to the room itself, as if the walls might carry information the radio refused to deliver. He wrote nothing. His pen remained still in his hand. Outside, the low vibration had become unmistakable. It was not loud, but it was persistent, threading itself through the air like a held note. No one identified it aloud. To do so would have required asking where it came from, and that question carried weight. A junior officer glanced at the door and then at the senior officer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He swallowed. The movement of his throat was visible, exaggerated in the lamplight. At the map table, the youngest officer reached for an eraser, rubbed out a marking, then stopped halfway through. The eraser hovered above the paper. After a second, he put it down and left the marking intact. He did not explain the change of heart. No one asked. Another message came in. The radio operator did not sit with it this time. He stood immediately, tearing the paper free with a single practiced motion. The sound of the tear cut cleanly through the room. Heads turned. He handed the message over. The senior officer read it slowly. He did not fold it right away. His eyes lingered on one line longer than the others. When he finally looked up, his gaze swept the room, not searching for agreement, not asking permission, simply taking inventory. "There's a delay," he said. No adjective followed. No cause was named. "A delay where?" someone asked gently, as if afraid to startle him. The senior officer looked back at the paper. "Upstream." The word was vague enough to be comforting. It suggested distance. It suggested time. The radio operator returned to his seat, but he did not put the headphones back on immediately. He stared at the radio as if waiting for it to speak without prompting. The man with the mustache shifted his stance. He took one step back from the table, then another, creating a small pocket of space around himself. His hands clenched once, then relaxed. He did not resume smoothing his lip. A vehicle engine outside started, then stopped almost immediately. The sound echoed briefly between buildings and died. No replacement sound followed. The silence afterward felt deliberate. The runner by the door reached for the latch without realizing it. His fingers closed around the metal. He froze. Slowly, he let go. His hand dropped back to his side, leaving a faint smear of moisture on the handle. Someone cleared his throat and suggested sending a confirmation request. Just a short one. Routine. The senior officer nodded again. "Draft it," he said. The radio operator began to write, then paused. He looked up. Which channel? The question lingered. Channels had been discussed earlier. Decided even. The fact that the decision had to be recalled rather than remembered felt significant. "Same as before," the senior officer said after a moment. The radio operator hesitated, then nodded. He adjusted the knobs with care that bordered on reverence. When he transmitted, his voice was low and even, stripped of inflection. He finished, released the switch and waited. No response came. Seconds passed. The lamp flickered again, longer this time, the flame thinning until it almost vanished. A collective breath was held. Then the light steadied, and the breath was released in fragments. "Again," the senior officer said quietly. The radio operator repeated the transmission. The same words, the same tone, the same expectation. Nothing answered. At the map table, fingers began to tap unconsciously. Once, twice, then stopped. A pencil rolled slightly, nudged by a sleeve, and was caught before it could fall. The sound it would have made felt unacceptable. Someone suggested stepping outside just for a moment to listen. The idea was dismissed without discussion. Outside was where the unknown lived. Inside, at least, there were walls. The vibration beneath the floor deepened. It was no longer ignorable. Cups rattled faintly against their saucers. The ink in the bottle trembled, creating tiny ripples that caught the light. The senior officer straightened. He adjusted his collar, smoothed his sleeves. The movements were small, precise, the kind a man made when preparing to be seen. He glanced at the clock. This time, the look lingered. A minute hand passed a mark it should not have passed yet. No one spoke. The youngest officer leaned in again, his finger hovering over the map. "If there's a delay," he began, then stopped. He did not finish the sentence. Finishing it would have required choices. The senior officer met his gaze. For a moment, something unspoken moved between them. Recognition, perhaps, or warning. Then the senior officer looked away. "Let's wait," he said. The word settled heavily. Waiting had always been their posture, but now it felt like a decision rather than a default. Outside, a sharp metallic sound rang out. Something dropped. Something struck. It was followed by hurried footsteps, then silence. The men inside did not move toward the door. They listened instead, counting the seconds until something else happened. Nothing did. The radio operator tried once more. His voice carried the faintest strain now, a tightening at the edges. He released the switch and leaned back, eyes closed for just a second longer than blinking aloud. When he opened them, he shook his head. Still no response. The senior officer exhaled slowly. He reached for the stack of messages, lifted them together, then set them back down. The weight was no longer enough to keep them flat. "We'll hold," he said. No one asked how long. The room seemed to contract around that statement. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. Every object suddenly had a presence, as if aware it might soon be remembered. The clock ticked. The vibration continued. The door remained closed. And somewhere between one tick and the next, the final window, thin, fragile, and already cracked, began to narrow unnoticed toward its end. It did not announce itself. Nothing rose in volume. No voice sharpened. No alarm found its courage. What changed was smaller than that. So small it could have been dismissed as coincidence, if coincidence still felt possible. The senior officer reached for the telephone. It was an old instrument, its surface dulled by years of hands and cleaning rags. It sat on a side table, slightly apart from the others, its cord coiled neatly as if order alone could guarantee usefulness. He lifted the receiver and held it to his ear. There was a pause. His brow furrowed. Not deeply, just enough to register effort. He adjusted the receiver, pressed it closer, listened again. His mouth tightened, then relaxed into something neutral. He set the receiver back down. "The line's quiet," he said. "Not dead, not cut, quiet." The distinction mattered, and everyone in the room understood why. Quiet meant waiting. Quiet meant possibility. Quiet meant there was still no reason to act. The radio operator tried again without being told. His movements were automatic now, muscle memory overriding deliberation. He transmitted on the agreed channel, then on a secondary one, his voice steady, professional, unchanged. When he finished, he remained leaning forward, finger resting on the switch, as if he might need to speak again without warning. Nothing answered. The vibration beneath the floor shifted. It did not grow louder. It changed direction, becoming less uniform, more uneven. A few men adjusted their stance instinctively, spreading their feet slightly, like sailors correcting for a subtle change in current. The lamp flickered once, sharply, then steadied. At the map table, the youngest officer made a small correction to a notation. Just a number, overwritten by another number almost identical to it. He paused, studied his work, then nodded to himself. The correction felt right, necessary. No one else noticed. The man with the mustache reached for his pocket watch at last. He opened it, looked, and snapped it shut again almost immediately, as if afraid the sight of the time might leave a mark. He did not share what he saw. He did not smooth his lip. Outside, a single engine started and stayed running. It did not move. It simply idled, low and patient, filling the air with a constant presence that made conversation feel intrusive. Someone asked whether they should inform the adjacent unit. The question was phrased carefully, framed as coordination rather than concern. The senior officer considered it. He looked at the map. He looked at the stack of messages. He looked at the radio operator, who met his gaze without expression. "Not yet," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily. A decision, finally, but one that preserved stillness rather than disrupting it. The radio operator nodded and removed his finger from the switch. He leaned back in his chair for the first time in hours. The motion felt like surrender. A runner appeared briefly in the doorway, someone from outside, breath visible in the cold air. He spoke a short sentence, barely audible, then stopped himself as if realizing he had spoken too quickly. The senior officer asked him to repeat it. The runner did. The sentence contained no catastrophe, no confirmation. Just an update, A minor deviation, the kind that happened all the time. Understood, the senior officer said. The runner waited, expectant, then was dismissed with a nod. The door closed again, sealing the room. The update was not written down. That was when the line was crossed. Not with a step, but with an omission. The clock ticked past another marker. The sound was precise, uncaring. The minute hand moved forward, indifferent to significance. The radio operator adjusted his headphones and froze. "Sir," he said softly. The word cut through the room, not sharply, but distinctly enough to gather attention. All eyes turned toward him. He did not look back at them. He was listening too hard for that. "There's interference," he said. The senior officer approached, standing just behind him now, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders. "What kind?" The radio operator hesitated. He swallowed. "Not static, something else. Can you clarify?" Another pause. "No." The honesty in the answer made it worse. The senior officer straightened and stepped away. He did not issue new instructions. He did not ask for alternatives. He simply returned to the map table and placed both hands flat on the paper again. "Maintain position," he said. It was not an order shouted across a battlefield. It was a sentence spoken into a room that had already committed itself to stillness, and because of that, it carried more weight than any command barked under fire. Outside, the idling engine cut off. The sudden absence of sound was jarring enough to make several men flinch. The silence that replaced it felt exposed, as if something protective had been removed. The vibration beneath the floor ceased. For a brief, impossible moment, everything was too still. Then, far away, but closer than before, came a low sound that was not machinery and not wind. It rolled rather than struck, a distant pressure that suggested mass and movement without revealing form. No one named it. The youngest officer looked at the senior officer, a question clearly forming. He did not ask it. Asking would have forced an answer, and answers had consequences. The senior officer checked his watch again. This time he did not hide the motion. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "We're past the window," he said. No one asked which one. No one disagreed. The sentence did not change anything physically in the room. The lamp still burned. The stove still crackled. The map still lay flat and orderly beneath their hands. But something had shifted irreversibly. The waiting that followed was no longer about choice. It was about inevitability. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. It was not the quiet of discipline or restraint. It was the quiet that comes after decisions have finished being possible, when sound itself seems unsure whether it should continue. Even the clock appeared to hesitate between ticks, as if time were no longer confident in its direction. No one spoke. The senior officer remained standing at the map table, hands still resting on the paper. His fingers no longer traced lines or tapped edges. They simply stayed where they were, holding the world in place for as long as it would allow. His posture was composed, almost formal, but the muscles along his jaw were tight, as if he were holding back words that no longer served any purpose. The radio operator sat perfectly still. The headphones rested over his ears, but his hands were folded in his lap now, the radio untouched. He listened anyway, not for messages, for confirmation that silence had truly taken over. His eyes remained fixed on the dial, unblinking. The youngest officer stood a step back from the table, arms at his sides, shoulders squared as if awaiting instruction that would never arrive. His breathing had slowed deliberately. Each inhale was careful, each exhale measured. He was trying to make himself small inside his own body, as if restraint might pass unnoticed by whatever was approaching. The man with the mustache leaned against the wall near the shelves. His pocket watch remained closed in his hand. He did not open it again. Time had stopped being useful to him. His gaze rested on nothing in particular, unfocused. His attention turned inward, where fear could be managed privately. The runner by the door stood at attention without realizing it. His boots were planted firmly now, heels aligned, posture rigid. He no longer glanced at the latch. Whatever had been holding him back had released him from anticipation. He was ready, but there was nowhere to go. The stove crackled softly, unaware of relevance. The sound felt inappropriate, almost intrusive, but no one moved to dampen it. The warmth it offered no longer mattered. Outside, the base had fallen into an unnatural stillness. No engines, no footsteps, no distant voices. Even the wind seemed to have withdrawn, leaving the air dense and unmoving. The window reflected the room faintly, ghost images of men frozen in place, their outlines pale and unreal. The lamp flickered once more, a brief sharp tremor of light that sent shadows jumping across the walls. This time, no one reacted. The flame steadied again, obedient, as if unwilling to be the first thing to fail. A faint sound arrived from far away. It was not loud enough to identify, not close enough to demand attention. It pressed against the edges of hearing rather than announcing itself, like a pressure change felt in the chest before the ears understand why. It did not rise. It did not fall. It simply existed. The senior officer closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, he did not look at the map anymore. He looked toward the window, not searching for confirmation, but acknowledging presence. His hands remained where they were. Removing them would have felt like permission. The radio emitted a soft, irregular pulse. Nothing intelligible, nothing actionable. The radio operator noticed and adjusted nothing. The sound faded on its own. Somewhere in the building a door creaked slowly, pushed by no visible force. The sound echoed faintly through corridors that were suddenly empty of purpose. It stopped halfway open and stayed there. Breathing became noticeable in the room. Not labored, not panicked, simply present. Men became aware of their own lungs, the rise and fall of chests, the way air felt cooler on the way in than on the way out. The clock ticked. No one looked at it. The youngest officer shifted his weight slightly. The movement was instinctive, a response to the floor beneath his boots vibrating faintly again. Not enough to be alarming, just enough to be undeniable. The vibration carried through the soles, through bone, through the table legs. It was steady now, certain. A cup on the table trembled and stopped. Ink in the bottle rippled once, then settled. The senior officer spoke, quietly, not to command, not to reassure, but to mark the moment. "Hold fast," he said. The words were unnecessary. Everyone was already doing so. No one reached for weapons. No one checked equipment. Preparation had ended earlier, unnoticed. What remained was presence, being exactly where one already was, exactly as one already had been. The distant sound grew slightly more defined. Not louder, just closer. A layered sound, heavy and continuous, like the movement of something too large to hurry. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. The runner swallowed. The mustached man closed his eyes. The radio operator removed his headphones slowly and set them on the desk, aligning them carefully, as if someone might later notice disorder. The senior officer straightened his spine. The lamp burned steadily. The clock ticked again. And then, in the space between 1 second and the next, before any signal, before any visible change, before history could complete its sentence, the room remained perfectly still, suspended at the edge of what had already begun.